Thank you so much to Loren and Sophia for being here. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in 1 minute. Just a few words about The Future Was Desert and why. Why even think about or talk about The Future Was Desert. Some of you may be old enough to have seen a film called Star Wars. It opens with 10 words, which have become mythologized, and those 10 words are a long time ago, comma, in a galaxy, far, comma, far away, and then 4 ellipses, which is interesting, breaking conventions. And then we're on a planet, it's called Tatooine. On Tatooine, humans are just one species. There are cars that seem to fly, there are spaceships, there are laser guns, and other things that we don't tend to associate with the past, because they haven't even happened in our modern present yet. This past is more like our future. Then the hero emerges in a desert landscape on his home planet. It's arid, it's also a very mercenary place. Tatooine happens to also be the deserts of Tunisia. The most recent episode of Star Wars, The Force Awakens, was partly filmed in Abu Dhabi, not so far from here. Again and again, science fiction speculations of the future take place in desert landscapes. Dune, Mad Max, to name 2 most obvious ones. What is it about this geological index of the deep past that possesses so much potential for the imagined future? What is the desert of the imagination, and how does this metaphor work in a future-forward fiction? So the first of my 2 guests, whose cushion do you have? Very appropriate. Is Sophia Al Maria. She's a filmmaker, a writer, an artist, and her book, many of you may have read, The Girl Who Fell to Earth, charts the time and spaces between our alternating homes of Qatar, United States, by way of Cairo and outer space. As Amal said, we initiated this topic in January in London at the ICA, where we showed the film that you just saw, and we're going to see the second part of the film right at the end of this session. I'm absolutely thrilled that we're able to continue this topic and this conversation with Loren Lucas. And Loren is an award-winning South African novelist who also writes screenplays, TV shows, comics, and journalism. Her novels include Zoo City, Broken Monsters, and The Shining Girls, and they've been translated into 26 languages. Will you please join me in officially welcoming Sophia Al Maria and Loren Lucas? So, Sophia, why don't we start with the film that we just saw, because it works very, very neatly into how and when you met Loren. So can you tell us when the deserts that are referred to in the film, but also where were you when you were thinking about making that film?
Yes, I would like to answer that. But I also wanted to bring something up really quick.
Go.
Which is, I just realized an even better quote, perhaps, to start with is from The Matrix, which is when Morpheus says, "Welcome to the desert of the real."
Desert of the real.
So on that note, and random thought, Loren and I met in South Africa. I had gotten out of the airport and literally driven to the Namibian border, where I was loafing in the company of a shoot that was happening. And while I was there, I started to learn about the rock art, which is readily visible in various places around South Africa, in the Cedarburg Mountains, for example, which it was a really profound sort of experience hiking to be alone with these like 20,000-year-old things, like sort of markings of someone who had been there, and it gives you kind of like temporal vertigo, I guess, is how I felt. And it was really exciting. And during that time, I was also reading a lot of Loren's work, and it sort of contributed to this sort of recipe of melange of like ideas and things I was thinking about in terms of various futures and time travel. So that was one of the reasons. Yes.
And what did someone introduce the two of you to each other?
Yes, Twitter and Peter Weber.
Mr. Twitter and Mr. Weber.
Yes.
God bless their souls.
At Peter Weber.
Maybe just to set some kind of basics here before we time travel and space travel around it. And it's one of the things we talked about, I guess, Sophia, in London, which was that our mental understanding now of a desert, of what we think of as a desert, is actually a relatively recent thing. And for example, I find it weird that apparently, geologically speaking, the largest deserts in the world are Antarctica and the Arctic.
Yes.
Which tells us actually what the real definition of a desert is. Maybe you want to say something.
Well, I always have to give caveats constantly because I'm actually sort of, Wikipedia is my science, unfortunately. I would love to learn how to read actual science writing. I'm working on that. But yeah, the desert is in fact nothing to do with, I guess, heat as we understand it, but simply the absence of, it's
life.
Absence of life, the absence of water, but also the original meaning was to do with the reason that deserted island is called a deserted island and often has palm trees on it is because it is the absence of life, exactly. Loneliness, which is where one has to go, I guess, in order to bring out the flowers of creativity. That's tweetable.
Welcome to the
That's
desert
tweetable.
of Sophia's Reel. And Sophia, could you tell us, one of my, actually, if one asks for a portrait of Sophia to publish online or in a magazine, you'll often be sent a picture of her at the top of a set of white steps, and those are the steps of Luke Skywalker's house.
They're not actually.
No, they're not. But can you tell us, did you make this pilgrimage to, a lot of people make this pilgrimage to the set where these scenes in Star Wars were filmed. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I haven't actually made the Tatooine pilgrimage. That place is oddly in an extremely lush location in New Zealand, a utopic commune built by an architect whose name I'm currently blanking on, in Wellington. However, we've talked quite a bit about those sets, and I believe there was a replica of Mecca. Maybe you can mention that, 'cause I've never seen the pictures of this thing, but it's near Tatooine.
It's in Morocco, and there are the sets for Star Wars, but also there is a fake Mecca, which is, cardboard and plywood. And apparently there are now pilgrims who are actually going there and treating it as a holy site.
Really?
Yeah. Which is mine, by the way. It's in my book. Everyone back off. No one's stealing my ideas. We don't talk about the good stuff in public.
Sorry.
But would either of you like to make that pilgrimage to? You had some workings with a producer, who was the gentleman who introduced George Lucas to that.
That's right.
Right.
Mr. Tarek Ben Ammar I was working on a project, and it was to be shot partially in his studios in Tunis. But it was odd. It was sort of small Italian villages, and I think a scale, like some sort of Babylonian city, and yeah, it was odd. The place. Film sets are these incredible. I'm sure that some of you have visited them. They're. It's like it's like a plywood matrix, plywood simulacra stretched across, stretched inside of a giant like hangar, but yeah.
But in a way, that goes obviously a way to invoke the qualities, or some of the qualities of the desert that paradoxically, through its so-called emptiness, is full of potential for both film and literature. So maybe I thought we'd talk about some of the qualities and how that then goes onto what I know you'd like to talk about, which is notions of cultural or mental desert. But perhaps we could just think in very, very basic, the allure of the desert as a fiction from someone who has a fictional imagination and is particularly trying to imagine the future.
Well, I'm mostly interested in cities, actually. But I think the desert it represents a blank canvas. And I think that's why so many science fiction films have been shot there and TV series, but also because obviously you can very easily shade that to be an alien landscape. So it was a cheap way of depicting the alien in the future. And it's also timeless. We came from the desert, so there is that kind of cyclical nature of science fiction and, in a galaxy long time ago. For me, I'm interested in the desert as a space. It's a very hostile environment. And the life that is there, and there is life, is hard won. It's a battle. And I think there's a lot of resonance to me at the moment with the cultural landscape and what we are doing as artists. And actually, when Sophia and I met, we went away into the mountains, in a very arid area. It wasn't quite desert. And we were talking a lot about global warming and Peter Weber's documentary 10 Billion, which is just depressing as hell, and about how the world is screwed. We're screwed. And I was in a state of despair. I was like, what is the point of making art? What is the point of writing? What is the point? We might as well just drink lots of champagne and descend into decadence and craziness and watch Rome burn, because it is burning. And at the end of that trip, when I was heading home, I had a creative breakthrough, which is that art is the light, and it's the only thing we have. And it is the light which can shine out of the darkness, and it is also the fire that we can use to burn shit down. So for me, it was, but I feel like we are operating within a hostile environment, within a desert of culture, where a dumbing down of culture, where someone like Trump can be raising to prominence, where journalism is falling apart, and we don't have long-form stories anymore. Everything is listicles and BuzzFeed, shorts. We're losing our sense of connection, our sense of story. And as artists, we are operating in that barren wasteland and fighting against it and trying to forge life and to spring up beautiful desert flowers.
Flowers of creativity.
Flowers of creativity. Your next romance novel, right?
My next romance novel, absolutely.
The Flowers of Creativity. You mentioned cities, and I wondered whether, for either of you, for both of you, is the city in kind of conceptual or imagistic terms the opposite of the desert? Or, because you once said to me that you think of the shopping mall as the desert in the city, which suddenly makes it a kind of Russian doll sort of situation. You've partly grown up in Qatar, in the Gulf, and there are particular kinds of deserts. And then South Africa has its deserts, which we can get on to in a minute. But just this relationship between desert and city, whether you could say something about that.
I guess, again, looping back to matrixdom, which now I can't get it out of my head. I think one of the things that I've come to in my various researches and like ongoing project about shopping malls is precisely that there's this sort of deep desolation that happens when you sort of like, I feel almost parched, like my mind is dry and sort of shriveling up inside of my skull when I've been inside of a mall for too long. And I've spent a week overnight in shopping malls in Doha before I came here. And it's interesting because even when there aren't any people there, it is still bustling with life. People are cleaning all of the shop windows, and there are these little sort of chores that are being done everywhere, and it's all this sort of like rhizomatic underneath the surface of the daytime mall situations happening at all times. And I think that that's not dissimilar to the way that desert plant life works, right? Sort of springing up at times but that's a part of it, I think, is there's this sort of like, you become so saturated also with the imagery and the reflections and the dry air and the sort of muzak that I definitely still feel it, like I'm stumbling through, and everything might end up like Jerry, and sort of right when I'm reaching the exit, expire. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, but
they do now.
Maybe that's over dramatic.
So this is the happy, cheerful talk. I don't know if you guys noticed.
Which the two pills in the Matrix, blue and red. One was this pill, and then there was another pill. This thing about the city and the desert I just find very, very interesting, because some of the really striking images that I've seen recently are these huge urban developments, particularly in Saudi Arabia over the last few years, which are never been inhabited. So you get we're used to, we have the archaeologist here. We're often already on top of cities. Cities turn back to, as it were, dust, and we build on top of them, cities on top of cities on top of cities. Now we have this incredible phenomenon of the instant ruined city, as though it were built to immediately disintegrate and be reabsorbed into the desert landscape. And I wonder whether, that seems to me, that chimes very well with your, if we need an instant image of where we are today in relation to consumption of resources and the kind of futility with which we consume those things, that seems to me like one of the most, it's an instant science fiction trope, right?
Absolutely, it's very Balladian. But it is also an indication of how short-lived things can be, and our impressions on the desert, it's fleeting. We're not made to last. Nothing is really made to last. And I think there's a cognizance which has to come in to how you work as well when you're thinking about that. That there's nothing wrong with being engaged with the now.
Mm-hmm. I'm reminded of that piece in the Abraj Prize, the one that was ashes from all the letters that had been lost. I thought that was that would be a nice companion piece after this talk, and go and hang out with that piece.
And just before I ask you, Loren, maybe to read something out for us, you mentioned The Matrix, and it makes me think of the 1990s. And then I think of the beginning of the 1990s.
I'm sorry, is it hard you don't want to go back there?
As long as I don't have to show photographs of myself, I'm fine.
You're always beautiful.
One of the ways in which the 1990s began here in the region was, of course, Gulf War I, which was, snappily titled Desert Storm. That was the official kind of U.S. military and U.S. government sort of title. And then a few years later, we had the book, Jean Baudrillard's book, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. And of course, Baudrillard being the philosopher in residence in The Matrix, right? So they even, Keanu Reeves stores his illicit material in a hollowed out version of Simulation and Simulacra. I wonder whether that, the coining of that term, desert storm, for what was a real watershed moment in the relationship between war and media. War and television in particular, right? Like, it was one of the first live wars that we saw. And so also makes, in relation to what you were saying about the instant convenience of the desert as a film set, in that case, the instant TV set, right? And made for, again, to go back to Joa's thing, a sublimely beautiful viewing experience, perversely, you know? Do you remember, how old were you when 7, 8? The
Around
Gulf War,
that, yeah.
around that time. Do you remember watching CNN at that time? Or do you remember it at all?
Yeah. I remember the flights of the missiles and how they looked like fireworks. And it was...
Because it was night green,
Yeah.
night vision green, right?
It was surreal. It was beautiful. And I think that removed you from the horror. It didn't feel personal. You didn't really get a sense of what people were really going through.
Yeah. Well, just to take it to the step after that, then there was the Zizek book, The Desert of the Real. And that posited, right, that the 20th century was all about this sort of experience of sublime, surreal, like, images of things, but that 9/11 was an awakening of some kind. So that's a sort of, I guess, an interesting addition to the pile of references that's accumulating at our feet right now.
Always at our feet. Couldn't just be on the coffee table.
No.
Before we ask you a few questions in a minute about your own history of writing, and maybe you could read the extract that you brought for us, please.
So I looked long and hard at what to read, and I was thinking about the desert as scarcity. And this is a chapter, first draft chapter, from my new novel, which is set in a world where 98% of the male population have died. So, yeah. "What is it, Mom?" Mila says, her voice hushed, and also muffled by the veil of the apologia, which speaks for us. The word sorry is blazoned over the Church of All Sorrows robes in bubblegum pink and neon green, over and over again. Sorry, head to toe. Sorry, with every step. I don't know, baby, maybe an accident? But I feel that clench of dread in my chest already, the sick surge of adrenaline because there are a woman in black body armor holding automatic weapons surging over the crosswalk against the red light. Traffic has come to a stop to allow them through. And maybe this is it. I think it 100 times a day. The soundtrack to our lives for the last 7 years. Maybe this is it. I tug her back, out of the way of the brusque woman gesturing with their guns to clear a path between us. A business exec in a pinstripe suit and a fake baby bump steps backward, driving the red sole of her high heel into my foot. I stifle my yelp. Mila leans in and whispers, "Ponies," keeping her voice in a low whisper the way I've drilled her. For a moment, I think she's talking about horses, which means it's mounted police and we can't possibly outrun them. But she's talking about their hair. The women in black all have scraped-back ponytails that flick behind them. Not police regulation, short back and sides, which means private security, which means they're not looking for us. Because Mila is Miles, and sheltering a male is a federal offense, even when it's your son, even when all you want is for him to have a better life, a real life, outside the government research labs, or worse, the reproductive harvesting centers. And it's easy to hide in plain sight when you're an embarrassing annoyance, worse even than Jehovah's Witnesses or Hare Krishnas. No one wants to meet your eyes, let alone peer under the veil when you are trying to press forgiveness on them. Have you heard the word, sister? It's a very simple one, the most important one. Take my hand. Let's say it together. Sorry. The security guard in front, burly blonde, shoos us all aside with the barrel of her gun. 3 feet, she barks. Back up 3 feet. The crowd backs up resentfully, because it's part of the infant safety statute after baby Abby was ripped apart, literally torn limb from limb. That's how desperate we are now, how hungry. You can see it in their eyes. The women who were ordinary commuters a second ago, craning to see, to get a glimpse of the baby. Here she comes now, pushing the Kevlar-reinforced pram, the mother, that sacred, unattainable thing, in distressed jeans and a couture bulletproof vest, which must be unbearable in the July heat, although maybe no worse than the robes we're wearing. I'm too tired, and I don't care enough to figure out if this is a movie star or a musician or a society wife or a cool tech CEO who can afford to buy sperm and the IVF and the rams and rams of tests to make sure she's not carrying the Jackmel virus. She flounces in her black and gold sneakers, looking straight ahead behind her oversized shades, with the faintest of smiles painted on her face, as if to convince us all that this is a pleasant stroll and this is ordinary. Because of course it is. It's how we are now. And I feel you, Mama, even though she will never know my pain, unless we get caught. As she goes past, I can't help it. I crane too. Maybe I snatch a glance at the baby, wide-eyed in that unfocused way, staring up through the riot shield canopy curved over her head. Or only think I do, before Captain Blonde Contempt is shoving me, the long metal barrel of her rifle against my chest. Back, I said. Sorry, I say, keeping my eyes downcast, willing Mila to do the same. I'm sorry. Her eyes scrape over the stiff robes we're wearing. We are loud and proud in our shame, the Church of All Sorrows, all those neon letters. Yeah, that's all you people ever say. Religious nutbag, stay the hell back next time. Yes, of course I say, I bite it back. The executive, in her pinstripe suit and alligator skin heels, glares at me. Like the faux baby bump she's wearing, strapped on under her blazer, is less embarrassing. But then, that's fashion this year. And I am anti-fashion. I am humiliation and a grief and an ugly reminder of all that was and will never be again, and the secret guilt we all carry, the knowledge that it was all our fault. That's the Church's line, that we carry the sins of the mothers and the sisters and the daughters for you. We are eternally sorry, sorry beyond rhyme and reason and all measure for what woman's errant ways have wrought upon our world. But I am not sorry at all. Not for me or for Mila. I am only sorry that we are stuck here, for now. I underestimated the city and its regulations. It's even worse than Atlanta. Worse than those first few ugly months barricaded in Disneyland. This is not a place you slip through and slip away. But we will have to, somehow. Thanks.
Lawrence, writers like superheroes have creation myths. Yesterday, Adrienne Mary Brown invoked one of the creation myths of Octavia Butler, which was her discovery of an excitement around science fiction, but then realizing that she and people like her, i.e. people of color, were not represented, and therefore became the impetus for her to write the kind of science fiction that she wrote. Could you say something about what was your way into science fiction, and then subsequently where you felt this would be your particular path through what has already existed?
Well, I was bitten by a radioactive spider.
Yes. Pesky things.
I read a lot of comics, and particularly the British comic 2000 AD. And 2000 AD, for all that Judge Dredd is, the poster child, he's an asshole and an awful symbol of a totalitarian state. And I was interested in the way it used metaphor and allegory to tackle social issues. And they dealt with a lot of really big ideas. Alan Moore's The Ballad of Halo Jones was a major influence on me. And it got into war and politics and moral compromise. And it felt like an exciting way of dealing with those things, as a great epic adventure story with bold ideas and crazy imaginings that also had something to say about the world. So when I started writing, that's kind of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to express some of my ideas about the world, to use science fiction as parable and allegory, to twist things around, to explore big ideas. And still, I think we all suffer from issue fatigue. We don't want to see any more bodies of little migrant kids who have died. It's too much. You want to change the channel and just watch the new Game of Thrones. And I think that science fiction and speculative fiction allow you a way to look at those issues in a way that feels new and that can kind of help you get over that short circuit, the issue fatigue.
And did you, I guess you were quite young when you encountered this material, were you conscious of the fact that most of the stuff you were reading were by men? Or were you able to also find things by women at that point? And has that changed over the years?
Sophia and I were sharing our dark fantasy past, where we both were huge Dragonlance fans. And of course that was written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. Also ElfQuest was written by Wendy Peony and drawn by her as well. So I felt like there were always women that whose work I could look at. Anne McCaffrey, Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler. I never felt a shortage of women writers. I never felt like that was impossible. But of course, I'm also white, and that meant that I was represented. But a friend of mine has a great theory about he calls it Smurf theory, which is that there's only one girl Smurf. I think there are two now, actually. But, you've got Hefty Smurf, and you've got Grumpy Smurf, and you've got, Papa Smurf, and they're all characteristics. Vanity Smurf. And then there's Girl Smurf, as if girl was a characteristic or a personality type. And I was very aware of that growing up. And I talk about with my daughter now, is that representation of woman and how in an action movie you'll have one girl, and she's the girl. She's not the super strong one, or she's not the Hulk. Although, yes, I know we also have She-Hulk, but yeah.
And I guess, I know, Sophia, you're not a huge fan of The Force Awakens. On the other hand, the main protagonist is female.
We've got a woman and a black man, and...
Tick.
Totally. And The Matrix, like all the men's rights activists who have been claiming The Matrix and the red pill as their mantra, now it's two trans women directors who made The Matrix, which is great. It's fantastic. It's lovely to see that kind of subversive stuff happening in culture.
You mentioned your whiteness, as it were, and of course that's...
I've tried to peel it off, it won't...
Yeah, I know. Just a lizard underneath. But maybe you could say something about the role that science fiction had played in South Africa, and something about that history, maybe leading up to apartheid, and then, if and how that changed after apartheid.
So for a long time, South African literature was about the struggle against apartheid. And it was very political, and we were talking about how a lot of the art coming out of Beirut at the moment, there is a feeling that it has to be about the war. And in South Africa, there was a feeling that you had to be writing about apartheid and writing against apartheid, which was before my time, of course, but it was deeply political, and the way a lot of writers, particularly Afrikaans writers, got around it was by using allegory. So instead of writing about the revolution happening in South Africa, they would write about the Irish Revolution. And people like James Coetzee wrote a book called Waiting for the Barbarians, which is a dystopian sci-fi, just bureaucratic horror show of a book, which was very much a metaphor for apartheid. So we've always used that as allegory and metaphor, and I think that's why 2000 AD resonated with me so much. But there's this crazy story about how mental the apartheid government was, which just speaks to the absurdity of that kind of totalitarian state. Where, do you guys remember the TV show V with the aliens? And they were seemingly benevolent, and they came down to Earth, and then they peeled off their faces, and they were actually lizards, and they were planning to eat all of us. So it went from a primetime slot on TV, kind of 7 o'clock on a Friday night, to suddenly 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, which meant I couldn't watch it. And I said to my mom, I said, what's going on? Like, why can't I watch my TV show? And she said, well, the South African government has a problem with it because the humans fighting the aliens call themselves freedom fighters, and that's not a word that the apartheid government likes. So yeah, and I was thinking about the story recently, and I went back to look at it, and I thought, this can't be true. That's just absurd. It's ridiculous. And I spoke to an old journalist friend of mine, and he was like, no way. No, that's not true. It was much worse than that. And the then state president was P.W. Botha, and his nickname was the big crocodile, die groot krokodil. And he was so vain, he thought the show was about him. He thought the Americans had made it as a piece of propaganda with the reptiles as aliens. And I think that just speaks to, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's amazing. So, yeah.
We're heading inevitably towards the end of our universe. I have one question for you, but before that, I just wanted to pick up on this term, which you're very associated with, Gulf futurism, which is predated somewhat by Afrofuturism. And I wonder whether either of you could say something about either the differences or the similarities, and whether when you were thinking about Gulf futurism a number of years ago, whether Afrofuturism was in the background or a kind of antecedent, and because I think both of them have relationships to landscapes. It would be nice to hear about that for a bit.
Well, I mean, one tends to grow out of one's ideas, and I think that but the Gulf futurism thing did grow out of, I think it's a bit of a misnomer in a lot of ways, but when I was writing the essay, At the Gaze of Sci-Fi Wahhabi, I was watching, I was quite obsessed with Space is the Place.
By Sun Ra.
Yeah, and various other works of that kind, and John Akamfra's The Angel of History and things like that. So there was a sort of, I guess, a bed layer of geographically locating, somehow coming to it from my own sort of geographic tendencies. However, I do wonder now, as when I'm asked about that phrase, whether it was because it was taken very much as an aesthetic thing, and I think geolocated futures is a difficult thing to think around. It was interesting listening to Noah's thing of like, where is this? And I much prefer, I think, in my current iteration of myself to not, I'm more interested in creating not like zones without border that are not sort of as specific. And we were talking earlier about how the desert does that. It sort of spreads across borders without anyone having any control. You can't vacuum the Sahara back across your border. So,
and maybe I could just
if
ask,
I could vacuum back Gulf futurism, maybe. But yeah.
You need to time travel her to make that happen.
I'll try.
I wondered whether before you'd met Sophia, whether you'd heard of the term or the phrase Gulf futurism at all.
Well, I think one of the other ways we came together was via William Gibson on Twitter, and I think he might have mentioned it. It's certainly a phrase that I had heard.
Yep.
I didn't associate with Sophia, but Afrofuturism feels trickier because it's become such an aesthetic thing, and it seems that anything about Africa with technology suddenly becomes Afrofuturist. And we're such a huge continent, and we're so diverse, you can't make those kind of glib assumptions about it.
So you'd also hoover it
Yeah,
backwards
I would.
in time.
I'd like to see lots of different kinds of movements rather than this one kind of catch-all, like the continent, the entire continent. Everything that happens there which has anything to do with technology, and our whole lives have to do with technology now, has to be Afrofuturist. Yeah.
And okay, my very last question, which I got to ask Sophia this in London, I would open up my palm and offer you a pill, and that pill would guarantee that you would only ever feel optimism. Would you take this pill, Loren?
No, I would not, because I feel like we have to confront...
This is why you guys are friends. She needed even less time to say, hell no.
We have to, especially as artists and writers, we have to confront the darkness. We have to go into the bad places of what it means to be human and find those cracks and fissures in society and find the things which grow in that. It's a moral obligation.
We started on a pessimistic note. we end on a pessimistic note. What a journey this has been. We're about to play Sophia's part 2 of the Future Was Desert film, but before we do that, and before we leave the stage, I just want to let you know, as soon as the film finishes, we're going to go into a break for 10 minutes. So please get some fresh air, some libation at the Global Art Forum Cafe, and come back in 10 minutes. And then before that, please join me in thanking the amazing Sophia Al Maria and Loren Lucas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can we play the film? Thank you.
To the desert was to exit time. The garden from whence we came. Time. What paradise. Let's start in the Neolithic wet period, when the Sahara was savanna and the Gulf a garden. Before Egypt, before Babylon, before Sumer, before Obed. There were cedar forests and silver mountains, and to the south was an oasis where they washed their weapons. That was before memory, before everything living there, in the shadow of a mountain, was exiled onto higher ground. A place beyond the valley that had once been called an oasis that had thrived for millennia, fed by 4 great rivers. This is when Obed began to till the soil, bankrupting arable lands to feed idols. And this is when the future resolved irreparably into dust. But the old idols were barren as ours, wasted bodies, rotten minds, whose lives are little more than a receding mirage. A mirage that will lead us to our own demise. A mirage called the siren of growth. Everyone in Malgo, in time out of time. The desert of Makwaland was in bloom. The land of the last, the first living, who carry a legacy, the burden of time, the yoke of knowledge, knowing, burdened. It's happening again. And here they come and go, where the lone and level sand stretch far away, digging after diamond mines deep beneath the daisies. And when the tectonic plates seize at the sky and wrench the stars down over Earth like a bright white shroud, we will join hands and let the desert of the future and the desert of the past close in around us in the manner of a dream.